protocols with really impressive properties. And so lecture 2, we're going to focus on a possibility result, meaning we're actually going to give a protocol from the early 1980s, which we're going to call the Doloff-Strong protocol. The Doloff-Strong protocol is for a single-shot consensus problem known as Byzantine broadcast. And so we'll also see in lecture 2 how state-machine replication, like we talked about in lecture 1, that multi-shot consensus problem does actually reduce to the single-shot Byzantine broadcast problem. So as a consequence of the Doloff-Strong protocol, we will also get state-machine replication with all of the properties that we might want. And what's really, really remarkable about the Doloff-Strong protocol is that it tolerates an arbitrarily large number of dishonest nodes. So you could literally have like 100 nodes, 98 of which are trying to confuse the remaining the two honest nodes, and they won't be able to do it in this protocol. In the synchronous model, even just these two honest nodes can sort of stay in sync, despite the best efforts of these 98 nodes that are trying to mess with them. Now, the bad news about the synchronous model is it's really, the assumptions are just too strong about guaranteed message delivery. They are really not appropriate for protocols that you're going to run on the internet scale, especially not protocols that might be securing billions of dollars and therefore, presumably subject to attacks. So you're not likely to see the Doloff-Strong protocol sort of referenced in, say, any blockchain protocol white papers. But it is, first of all, it's a famous protocol. Second of all, it does show that, if you happen to have bounds on message delay, you can kind of do amazing things. And third of all, it'll be a good kind of warm-up. We'll get our feet wet with thinking about what a consensus protocol might look like and how much you use things like digital signatures to sort of communicate between different honest nodes. In lecture 3, we're going to see our first impossibility result. So this will actually be another result like the lecture 6 result, which says that 67% honest nodes is needed. So specifically, in lecture 3, we'll drill down on one key assumption that the Doloff-Strong protocol makes use of, which is usually called the PKI assumption. Here, PKI is for public key infrastructure. And so this means you're not only assuming that cryptography exists, right, that anybody has access to a secure digital signature scheme, you're also assuming that prior to the commencement of the protocol, all of the nodes running the protocol have exchanged their public keys. So the protocol sort of wakes up, starts running, and all of the nodes' public keys are common knowledge. And so therefore, if anyone else signs a message, you're in a position to verify that that message really was signed by the sender. So in a blockchain context, the PKI assumption is fairly palatable, but it winds up being really interesting, at least in the synchronous model, to consider what happens without that so-called trusted setup. And so that's what this impossibility result in lecture 3 says, right? So Doloff-Strong, using PKI, can tolerate any number of dishonest nodes. If you don't have PKI, we're going to prove in lecture 3, you can only tolerate less than a third dishonest nodes. The proof of this result, this impossibility result, is really very slick, very impressive. Sometimes it's called the hexagon argument for reasons you'll see. And so what I'd say is, for those of you that really like math and like cool proofs, this might be the number 1 lecture out of the 6 you might enjoy. Conversely, if you don't really care about cool proofs, then if you were going to skip one of these 6 lectures, I would probably skip lecture number 3. Again, it's sort of a famous, super interesting result, but it's not quite as essential for the rest of this lecture series story as the other 5 of these 6 lectures are. So that's lectures 2 and 3, and the main takeaway from the synchronous model is that, the good news is you have sort of protocols with amazing guarantees. The bad news is the assumptions are really too strong, to model blockchain protocols operating over the internet. So really, we're going to have no choice but to try to weaken our assumptions about how the communication network behaves. That naturally leads us to asking, what happens if we assume nothing about the communication network, which then is sort of more or less exactly the asynchronous model. So the good news about the asynchronous model is that because you're assuming almost nothing about the underlying communication network, any positive result, any consensus protocol you could come up with that actually had any provable guarantees would sort of automatically be super interesting, because it would have those guarantees even with so little assumptions about how the underlying network works. The problem is going to be, the bad news is that, we will have thrown out the baby with the bathwater, in the sense that there's actually not going to be any good consensus protocols, or at least good deterministic consensus protocols, in the asynchronous model. And so that there is maybe the most famous impossibility result in distributed computing, something known as the FLP impossibility result. And so the proof of this result, this FLP impossibility result stating the consensus is impossible in the asynchronous model, that's going to be the hardest proof that we see in any of these 6 lectures. Probably the hardest proof we're going to see anywhere in the lecture series. So it's actually going to span both. We'll get started on it in lecture 4. There'll be a natural kind of breaking point, and then we'll resume in lecture 5 and finish the complete proof of that very famous result. So the takeaway from these lectures 4 and 5 is that's going to be that the asynchronous model, really you just don't make enough assumptions. I mean, you wind up not having any good consensus protocols at all. So apparently we need a third model, maybe slightly less natural, but a third model, which is going to sit in between synchronous and asynchronous, where the assumptions are weaker than in the synchronous model and therefore more relevant to protocols that operate on internet scale. But on the other hand, also have stronger assumptions than in the asynchronous model so that positive results actually exist. So there actually exist protocols, like for example the Tendermint protocol, that have provable guarantees. A final comment, just to situate these 6 lectures in sort of the broader context of the blockchain world. So if you go and look at the different sort of so-called layer 1 protocols that are out there, okay, so blockchain protocols that really take responsibility for consensus themselves, as opposed to something that's built on top. So if you look at the main layer 1 blockchain protocols, you will notice that, most of them, not all of them, but most of them fall into one of 2 camps. The Tendermint protocol is a canonical example of camp number 1. And so these protocols really build on sort of the classic consensus protocols that were invented in the 1980s and sort of bring them into the blockchain world. And you often hear these types of protocols referred to as BFT type consensus protocols. Here BFT stands for Byzantine Fault Tolerance. And there's a number of examples. I mentioned how Tendermint is kind of the type of consensus that's powering Cosmos and Terra. Algorand is another blockchain you might have heard of, which is really sort of BFT style in this sense. Also Hotstuff, which is the consensus protocol that Facebook is proposing for their cryptocurrency Diem, also in the spirit of these BFT type protocols. So there's really a number of interesting protocols that lie in that camp. On the other hand, you probably noticed that I didn't mention the 2 most famous blockchains of them all, Bitcoin and Ethereum, and indeed they belong to camp number 2. They are not BFT type protocols. They are what are called longest chain protocols. So understanding the protocols in camp number 2, longest chain protocols like Bitcoin and Ethereum, that's going to be the first order of business after we finish understanding these BFT type protocols. So we'll get started with longest chain consensus beginning with lecture 8. So at the conclusion of these 6 lectures, you will have accomplished 2 really important things. So number 1, you'll have mastered the basic concepts behind one of the 2 major paradigms for blockchain protocol design to date, these BFT type protocols, which again includes a number of sort of very prominent examples in the blockchain world. But number 2, and maybe even more important, is you will have the mental model and the definitions to be able to understand not only longest chain consensus protocols in an operational sense, like how they work, but you will also be in a position to understand the different sets of trade-offs that longest chain protocols make compared to BFT type protocols. Like I said earlier, an overarching theme of this lecture series is to emphasize principles over protocols. And so while we will be learning how various specific protocols like Tendermint, Bitcoin, Ethereum, etc. Work, and we'll learn about examples of these 2 camps, BFT type protocols and longest chain type protocols, what's even more important to remember is sort of the lens through which we can look at these different parts of the design space and assess the different trade-offs that they are making. So for example, you will often see in discussions people talk about how, some type of blockchain favors safety. And they're referring to BFT type protocols usually when they talk about that. Whereas other protocols favor liveness, usually referring to longest chain protocols like Bitcoin and Ethereum. So by mastering the partially synchronous model and the impossibility results therein, you will actually know exactly what people mean when they say that blockchain A favors safety, blockchain B favors liveness. You will also be in a position to really fundamentally understand why different blockchain protocols fail in different ways. One obvious way a blockchain protocol can fail is it just stops making any progress. Like it just stops doing any work. No sort of further transactions get executed, at least for some period of time. And that is exactly the way in which protocols in this first camp, BFT type protocols, that's exactly the way in which they fail. So, for example, whenever you hear about like a bug in sort of Cosmos, which again is built on Tendermint, sort of what one